The rain came down in violent sheets as traffic crawled through downtown Chicago, turning the streets into rivers of reflected headlights and broken neon. But inside the back seat of a black armored sedan, billionaire Victoria Hale barely noticed the storm. She had spent most of her life ignoring people like the man she was now staring at through the rain-streaked glass. Men with exhausted faces and cheap jackets. Men invisible to the world. Men who survived one impossible day at a time. Yet something about this one refused to let her look away. For blocks ahead, under the relentless pounding rain, a tall man with dark hair soaked to his skin staggered down the sidewalk, carrying a limping stray dog wrapped tightly against his chest like it was something priceless. His face twisted with pain every few steps. But he never slowed down, never cursed, never stopped protecting the trembling animal from the storm with his own body. Around him, people rushed past with umbrellas and lowered heads, pretending not to see. But Victoria saw everything. She saw the way he nearly slipped crossing the flooded intersection. She saw him tighten his grip when the frightened dog whimpered. She saw a little pink backpack bouncing against his side, hanging from one shoulder because his other arm was occupied carrying the injured animal. And she saw the little girl standing beneath the awning of a closed convenience store up ahead, eyes full of fear as she watched him fighting through the rain toward her. "Who was that guy?" Victoria quietly asked her driver, though she knew he wouldn't have an answer. The driver glanced into the mirror. "Just some nobody, I guess." But Victoria kept staring, because powerful people learn to recognize performance, manipulation, and ambition instantly, and this man carried none of those things on his face. Only exhaustion, only determination, only the desperate refusal to abandon something weaker than himself. And without understanding why, Victoria Hale, the woman newspapers called the Iron Queen of Wall Street, leaned forward and softly said the words that would change all of their lives forever. "Follow him." 3 hours earlier, Ethan Cole had been standing in the frozen foods aisle of a small grocery store, trying to calculate whether he could afford both cough medicine for his daughter Lily and enough gas to finish his delivery shift that night. The math never worked anymore. Ever since the medical board revoked his surgical license 2 years earlier, life had become an endless sequence of compromises disguised as decisions. Rent or repairs, groceries or electricity, sleep or another shift. He tucked the medicine under his arm anyway because Lily's cough had worsened during the week, then checked his phone and saw 3 new delivery requests blinking on the app. Another late night. Another promise to Lily that he'd be home soon. Outside, the storm clouds had already swallowed the city skyline whole. By the time Ethan picked Lily up from after-school care above the neighborhood church, the rain had started hammering the streets hard enough to shake the windows. "Daddy, are we still getting pizza tonight?" Lily asked hopefully as she climbed into the passenger seat of his aging sedan, her tiny shoes dripping rainwater onto the stained floor mats. Ethan forced a smile despite the knot in his chest. "Maybe tomorrow, Buck. Tonight might be more of a cereal kind of celebration." Lily giggled softly. "That means we're broke again?" He laughed under his breath because she had inherited too much honesty from her mother. "Temporary financial inconvenience," he corrected. Very official adult phrase. "Sounds broke." "It absolutely means broke." She smiled and leaned her head against the window while he drove through the worsening storm, windshield wipers barely keeping up with the rain. Ethan glanced at her reflection and felt the familiar stab of guilt settle into his ribs. She deserved more than this life. More than cramped apartments and thrift store clothes and watching her father work himself hollow trying to survive. Before everything fell apart, there had been a house in the suburbs, vacations, stability, plans for the future. Before the scandal, before the dead patient, before the hospital protected its reputation by sacrificing him, Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel and forced the memories away. Thinking about his old life never changed anything except making the present hurt more. 2 hours later, after dropping Lily at home with strict instructions not to open the door for anyone except him, Ethan was hurrying through an alley behind a pharmacy, carrying 2 grocery bags for a delivery when he heard it. A low, broken whine buried beneath the roar of the storm. At first he thought it was the wind scraping against the dumpsters. Then it came again, weak, trembling, alive. Ethan stopped walking. Water poured from his hair into his eyes as he turned toward the sound. Curled against the brick wall behind an overflowing dumpster was a muddy German Shepherd mix with one front leg bent unnaturally beneath its body. The dog bared its teeth weakly, terrified and shaking violently from cold and pain. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Hey there," he murmured, crouching carefully despite the rain soaking through his jeans instantly. "Easy." The dog tried to drag itself backward and cried out sharply when pressure hit the injured leg. Ethan's stomach tightened. He knew injuries. Even after 2 years away from medicine, his instincts still moved faster than thought. Fracture. Possible ligament damage. Infection setting in. The dog wouldn't survive the night out here. Ethan looked up toward the street where headlights blurred through the storm. He looked at the delivery bags in his hands. Late deliveries meant penalties on the app. Penalties meant less money. Less money meant overdue rent. Rational people would keep walking. But Ethan had spent his entire adult life unable to walk away from suffering once he saw it. It was both the best and worst thing about him. He slowly removed his jacket despite the freezing rain and wrapped it around the trembling animal. "You picked the wrong city to quit in, buddy," he muttered softly. Then, with a strained breath, he lifted the dog carefully into his arms. The animal whimpered but didn't fight him. Ethan adjusted his grip and started toward the veterinary clinic 4 long blocks away, while thunder cracked overhead like artillery fire. Halfway down the first block, his phone rang. "Lily, Daddy?" she asked quietly when he answered. "You okay?" Ethan glanced down at the injured dog pressed against his chest and kept walking through the storm. "Yeah, Bug. I'm okay. You sound tired." He smiled sadly despite himself. "Little bit. When are you coming home?" Ethan looked ahead at the endless rain, the flooded sidewalks, the glowing vet signs still impossibly far away. Then he tightened his arms around the shaking stray and kept moving forward into the storm, unaware that from the back seat of a black luxury sedan across the intersection, the most powerful woman in the city had just begun watching him like her entire understanding of humanity was starting to crack open. Victoria Hale had built a billion-dollar empire by trusting one instinct above all others. People always revealed themselves eventually. Give them enough money, enough pressure, enough temptation, and the mask always slipped. That belief had carried her from being the overlooked daughter of a ruthless finance tycoon to becoming the most feared investor on Wall Street. A woman capable of dismantling companies with a single interview or reviving industries with one strategic acquisition. But as her driver slowly followed the soaked single father through the flooded streets of Chicago, Victoria felt something deeply unfamiliar clawing at the edges of her certainty. Confusion. The man carrying the injured dog didn't know anyone was watching him. There were no cameras, no audience, no reward waiting at the end of those 4 brutal blocks through freezing rain and ankle-deep water. Yet every time his grip slipped from exhaustion, he adjusted the animal carefully against his chest before thinking about himself. Twice he stopped beneath traffic lights, not to rest, but to shield the trembling dog from the rain with his own body. Victoria couldn't explain why she couldn't look away. "You want me to pull over?" her driver asked carefully. "No," she answered immediately, eyes fixed on the man outside. "Just stay back." The sedan crawled silently behind him as Ethan finally reached the emergency veterinary clinic near the edge of downtown. The fluorescent open sign flickered weakly through the storm while Ethan shoved through the glass doors carrying the muddy dog against his chest. Victoria watched him disappear inside, then after a long moment stepped out of the car herself. Rain soaked her expensive coat instantly, but she barely noticed. Inside the clinic, chaos buzzed beneath harsh white lighting. Phones rang. Dogs barked from examination rooms. A tired receptionist stood behind the counter arguing with Ethan while water pulled around his boots. "Sir, I understand," the woman said apologetically, "but emergency surgery requires payment up front unless you qualify for financing." Ethan shifted the dog carefully in his arms while trying to catch his breath. His clothes were soaked through, his hair dripping onto the tile floor. "Can you at least stabilize him first?" he asked quietly. "Please. His leg's infected. The estimate is $3,100. Ethan's face tightened almost invisibly. "Okay," he whispered, though it clearly wasn't okay at all. He set the dog gently onto the counter while pulling out his phone with trembling fingers. Victoria stood near the entrance unnoticed, watching him open his banking app. The glow from the screen illuminated his exhausted face for one brief second before he closed his eyes. $42. Victoria didn't know why that number hit her like a punch to the chest. Maybe because he still looked up afterward and asked, "Can I make payments?" instead of walking away. The receptionist hesitated helplessly. "Sir." Ethan nodded slowly before she could finish. He understood. Rules were rules. The dog whimpered weakly on the counter, and Ethan stroked its muddy fur with heartbreaking gentleness. "I know, buddy," he murmured. "I know." Victoria stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Put it on my account." Both Ethan and the receptionist turned toward her in surprise. Up close, Ethan looked even more exhausted than he had in the ring. There were dark circles carved beneath his eyes, and the kind of bone-deep fatigue that sleep alone never fixed. "Ma'am," the receptionist said instantly, recognizing Victoria now with visible panic. "Of course." Ethan frowned slightly. "You don't have to do that." "I know," Victoria replied calmly. "I want to." Ethan looked genuinely uncomfortable accepting help. Not prideful exactly, just unfamiliar with kindness that came without conditions. "I can pay you back," he said after a moment. Victoria almost laughed because nobody ever spoke to her that way. People asked her for investments, favors, influence. They lied to impress her or manipulated to gain access to her world. But this soaked stranger standing in a veterinary clinic at midnight was worried about owing her money for saving a stray dog. "Focus on the dog," she answered. "We'll discuss repayment later." The veterinarian rushed the animal into surgery moments later, leaving Ethan suddenly standing motionless in the waiting room like his body no longer knew what to do without an emergency to solve. Victoria studied him quietly while thunder rattled the windows outside. "You carried him 4 blocks in this weather?" she finally asked. Ethan rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. "Closest clinic that was open. Most people would have kept walking." He shrugged faintly. "Most people are probably smarter than me." Something about the answer unsettled her even more because he wasn't trying to sound noble. He honestly believed helping had simply been the obvious thing to do. Ethan's phone buzzed again. His expression immediately softened when he answered. "Hey, Bug." Victoria listened despite herself to the tiny voice speaking rapidly through the speaker. "Daddy, are you still coming home?" The thunder's getting louder. Ethan glanced toward the surgery doors. "Soon, Lily. I had to help somebody first." "A person?" she asked sleepily. Ethan looked through the glass at the injured stray beyond the hallway. "A dog." There was a pause. "Is he scared?" Ethan smiled for the first time all night, and the transformation caught Victoria completely off guard. Exhaustion still shadowed his face, but suddenly warmth lived there too. "Yeah," he admitted softly. "Pretty scared." "Then don't leave him alone." Victoria felt something twist painfully inside her chest at those words. Because she suddenly realized exactly why Ethan had stopped in that alley. Not because he was trying to be heroic. Because somewhere along the way, this struggling single father had taught his daughter that abandoning frightened things was unacceptable. And now he lived by the same rule himself. 40 minutes later, the veterinarian emerged from surgery, peeling off gloves. "He's stable," she announced. Ethan exhaled sharply like he'd been holding his breath the entire time. Torn ligament. Broken paw. Infection from being untreated too long. But he should recover. Ethan closed his eyes briefly in relief before asking the first question that mattered to him. "How much do I owe?" Victoria stared at him in disbelief. Not "will he survive?" Not "can I see him?" Money came last for him even now. The veterinarian glanced awkwardly toward Victoria. "It's already handled." Ethan looked at Victoria again. Clearly struggling with gratitude he didn't know how to express. "Thank you," he said quietly. And for some reason, hearing sincere gratitude from a man who expected nothing from her affected Victoria more than any praise she'd received in years. Over the next several days, she found herself thinking about him constantly. About the rain, the dog, the little girl on the phone. Curiosity turned into obsession quickly enough that she had her assistant investigate him. The report arrived 48 hours later in a thick folder on her desk inside her penthouse office overlooking the city skyline. Victoria opened it casually at first. Then she stopped breathing halfway through page 3. Ethan Cole had once been one of the most respected trauma surgeons in the state. Graduated top of his class. Specialized in emergency surgery. Known for impossible saves under pressure. Until 2 years earlier, when a teenage patient died during a controversial operation that exploded into national headlines. Negligence. Failed procedure. Suspended license. Career destroyed overnight. Victoria leaned back slowly, stunned. None of it fit the man she had watched carrying a wounded stray through a storm. She kept reading. Divorced? No. Widowed. Wife killed in a highway accident 18 months before the scandal. One daughter. Massive debt. Working multiple delivery jobs. No lawsuits filed. No interviews given. No public defense of himself whatsoever. That was the detail that bothered Victoria most. Powerful men always fought to protect themselves. But Ethan had simply disappeared after losing everything. Victoria stared out at the glowing city lights beyond her office windows while thunder echoed faintly in the distance again. Then she looked back down at the photograph clipped to the file. Ethan stood outside the veterinary clinic holding the recovering dog, while a smiling little girl hugged his side. Tired eyes. Cheap clothes. Quiet sadness. Yet somehow more dignity than most billionaires Victoria knew. And for the first time in years, Victoria Hale felt something dangerously close to admiration beginning to grow inside her guarded heart. The storm that changed Ethan Cole's life should have ended at the veterinary clinic. But in the weeks that followed, it only grew larger, pulling all of them towards something none of them were prepared for. The stray dog Lily named Storm recovered slowly inside Ethan's cramped apartment above the laundromat in Chicago, limping awkwardly across squeaky wooden floors while Ethan balanced delivery shifts, overdue bills, and endless paperwork from creditors threatening legal action. Yet despite the exhaustion grinding him down day after day, something in the apartment had changed. Lily laughed more. The silence felt less heavy. And unexpectedly, Victoria Hale kept appearing in their lives like someone trying to solve a mystery she couldn't let go of. At first it was small things. A shipment of expensive dog food anonymously delivered to Ethan's apartment. A referral to a physical therapist for Storm's injured leg. Then one afternoon, Victoria herself showed up outside Lily's school holding coffee. She clearly didn't know how to order properly. Your assistant didn't have to do all this, Ethan told her awkwardly as they walked together beneath orange autumn trees, while Storm trotted carefully beside them. Victoria glanced at him. I didn't send my assistant. Ethan frowned slightly. You bought orthopedic dog beds yourself? I own several companies, Ethan. I'm capable of online shopping. To his surprise, he laughed. A real laugh. Brief, rusty, unfamiliar after so many difficult years. Victoria noticed immediately. So did Ethan. The moment lingered between them longer than either expected. But behind Victoria's growing attachment to Ethan was something darker she couldn't ignore. The deeper her investigators dug into the collapse of his medical career, the uglier the story became. Private emails vanished from hospital servers. Witness statements had been rewritten. Surgical logs altered after the patient's death. And at the center of everything stood Dr. Raymond Mercer, the hospital's celebrated lead surgeon and one of the most politically connected men in Illinois. According to the official record, Ethan had frozen during a critical procedure on a senator's teenage son, leading to catastrophic mistakes that killed the patient on the operating table. But buried beneath layers of legal protections and confidential settlements was the truth. Mercer had made the fatal error. Mercer had panicked. And Mercer had allowed the hospital board to destroy Ethan's life rather than expose the negligence that could collapse donor trust and wipe billions from the hospital's valuation. Victoria sat alone in her penthouse office at 2 in the morning reading testimony from nurses who had been pressured into silence. Her jaw tightened with every page. Because for the first time in years, she wasn't reading about numbers or investments or corporate risk. She was reading about a good man being sacrificed by powerful people protecting themselves. And what unsettled her most was discovering Ethan had known the truth all along. Why didn't you fight back? She finally asked him days later, while helping Lily carve pumpkins on the apartment fire escape. Ethan's carving knife stopped moving for one brief second. Wouldn't have mattered. That's not an answer. He leaned back in his chair quietly, while Storm rested near his boots. After my wife died, Lily stopped sleeping through the night. She thought everybody she loved would disappear while she was asleep. His eyes stayed fixed on the city below them. Lawyers wanted a public war. Reporters outside the apartment. Court hearings for years. Every ugly detail dragged onto television. Victoria said nothing. Ethan swallowed hard before continuing. I figured losing my career was better than my daughter losing whatever piece she had left. The words hit Victoria harder than she expected, because she suddenly understood the impossible thing about Ethan Cole. The world had taken nearly everything from him: his career, reputation, future, and somehow it had failed to make him cruel. A week later, Victoria made a decision that terrified every advisor around her. She announced the largest charity gala in Hale Foundation history, a nationally televised fundraiser for emergency animal rescue and trauma care reform hosted in New York City. Senators, celebrities, CEOs, and hospital executives flooded the guest list. Financial news outlets immediately speculated that Victoria was preparing another massive acquisition. None of them suspected the truth. Ethan almost refused to attend. "I don't belong at things like this," he muttered while struggling with the collar of the borrowed tuxedo Victoria's assistant had delivered. Lily rolled her eyes dramatically from the hotel bed. "Daddy, you once operated on people's brains." "Not brains. Whatever. Important body stuff." Even Victoria smiled when they arrived at the ballroom that night. Ethan looked painfully uncomfortable beneath the chandeliers and camera flashes, while Lily stared wide-eyed at the towering ice sculptures and orchestra. Storm, now healthy enough to walk confidently again, wore a small black service harness and received more attention than half the celebrities present. But beneath the glamour, tension coiled tightly beneath Victoria's calm expression. Because seated only 20 feet away was Dr. Raymond Mercer alongside several hospital board members who had helped destroy Ethan's life. They smiled confidently, believing themselves untouchable. Then the lights dimmed. Victoria stepped onto the stage. Silence swallowed the ballroom instantly. "Most people believe power protects the truth," she began calmly. "Tonight you're going to watch the truth destroy power instead." Ethan frowned from his table, confusion crossing his face. Then giant screens illuminated behind Victoria, displaying hospital records, surgical timelines, internal emails, witness testimony. One by one, Victoria dismantled the official story surrounding the death that ended Ethan's career. The ballroom erupted into horrified whispers. Mercer's face drained of color as altered reports appeared on screen beside original medical records proving Ethan had actually saved multiple patients that same night after Mercer froze during complications. "This hospital," Victoria said coldly, "destroyed an innocent man to protect investors, political donors, and executive bonuses." News cameras exploded with flashes across the room. Mercer abruptly stood. "This is outrageous." But federal agents were already moving through the ballroom toward him. Gasps rippled across the crowd as investigators intercepted several board members attempting to leave through side exits. Ethan sat frozen in disbelief while Lily grabbed his hand tightly beneath the table. "Daddy," she whispered. He looked physically unable to process what was happening. Victoria turned toward him then, her voice softening for the first time all evening. "Ethan Cole spent 2 years being called incompetent, dangerous, and weak." The massive ballroom fell silent again. But while powerful people protected themselves, he spent those same 2 years raising his daughter, helping strangers, and carrying wounded things through storms when nobody else would. Ethan lowered his eyes, overwhelmed by the attention. Victoria stepped closer to the edge of the stage. "So tonight, I'm announcing the creation of the Cole Trauma and Rescue Foundation, a nationwide emergency care network for uninsured families and abandoned animals, with Dr. Ethan Cole as its director." For one suspended heartbeat, Ethan simply stared at her. The room exploded into applause around him, but he barely heard it. Because after years of surviving quietly in the shadows, after losing everything he once believed to find him, someone had finally seen the truth of who he was. Not the scandal, not the failure, the man beneath it. Later that night, long after reporters flooded the streets outside and Mercer's arrest dominated every major news channel in America, Ethan returned alone to the quiet hotel rooftop, unable to breathe beneath the weight of everything that had happened. The city glittered endlessly below him while cold wind tugged at his jacket. "You disappeared pretty fast for the guest of honor." Victoria's voice came softly from behind him. Ethan turned to find her standing near the rooftop doorway, heels abandoned in one hand, like she was finally too exhausted to keep performing elegance. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Ethan laughed weakly under his breath. "You blew up half the medical establishment tonight." Only the corrupt half. He shook his head slowly. You didn't have to do any of this. Victoria studied him carefully beneath the city lights. Yes, she said quietly. I did. Ethan frowned slightly. Victoria stepped closer, vulnerability flickering across her face for the first time since he'd met her. My father used to say kindness was just weakness people used to survive until power arrived. She glanced down at the streets far below them. Then I watched a broke single father carry a wounded stray dog 4 blocks through a storm when nobody was watching. Her eyes lifted back to his. And suddenly I realized I'd spent my entire life misunderstanding what strength actually looks like. Ethan stared at her speechless while rain began falling softly against the rooftop around them once more. Not violent like before. Gentle. Quiet. Almost warm. Behind them, through the rooftop doors, Lily's laughter echoed faintly somewhere inside the hotel ballroom, while Storm barked excitedly after someone dropped food near the catering tables. Ethan looked toward the sound, then back at Victoria standing beside him in the rain. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the future no longer felt like something he had to survive alone.